Welcome. We're on section 11B right now, talking about a very important subject, which is marriage. As most people know, I've been married for a while. Marriage is a challenging enterprise, and especially in a gospel context, one in which we want to do an excellent job. And of course, pornography addiction has a very deleterious effect on marriages and really threatens the marital bond. And so we'll discuss how to strengthen the marriage and also the role a wife can play in helping her spouse to recover. So I want to read a scripture, Doctrine and Covenants 88:21-22. And they are not sanctified through the law which I have given you. Even the law of Christ must inherit another kingdom, even that of a terrestrial kingdom or that of a celestial kingdom. For he who is not able to abide the law of a celestial kingdom cannot abide a celestial glory. So obviously it's important for us to understand what celestial law might be and what it looks like and how to use it. One way to get started and understand celestial laws is to think about celestial principles. And so I'll name some of them and I think you'll get the idea. Because I think we all have sort of an inherent understanding of these things. So some celestial marital principles are unity, quality time together, responsibility, agency, continuing the courtship, sacrifice, honesty, balance in giving, helping without being asked, respect, love and affection, loyalty, emotional support, humility, cooperation. So when you hear those things, we recognize that's a higher way of life. Those are the things we talk about in the church. In order to have successful marriage, rather than focus so much on what others should do, what changes need to be made, we need to be focusing on ourselves, developing our ability to live by celestial principles. President Howard B. Lee said, "Great love is built on great sacrifice, and that home where the principle of sacrifice for the welfare of each other is daily expressed is that home where there is great love." Part of being married is having a willingness to sacrifice and to think of others. And if we don't do that, we're planning on having a mediocre marriage. And most of the time when I ask people, do you want to have a great marriage? Guess what they say? Everyone says yes. And I'll tell them, well, if you want to have a great marriage, you have to be based on correct principles and you have to be willing to sacrifice. There's no other way. Another important celestial principle that's violated often is respect. Ephesians 5:33 says, "Nevertheless, let every one of you in particular so love his wife, even as himself, and the wife see that she reverence her husband." Great counsel, isn't it? This means even when we're irritated. And this is a challenge for us emotionally. When we're married, we're all of a sudden in the Olympics of emotional management. It's not for little kids. Marriage is for people that are serious about being responsible adults. One of the problems we have in relationships is we kind of live in a fantasy state. I think partially we grow up, and we think of marriage and we think of how we'd like it to be, and it's usually about how people will treat us. And so one of the fantasies that's very typical is we have this idea that when we notice these problems, because reality hits after you're married a while and you notice, wow, my spouse doesn't do everything I think they should do. And so we decide, I'll just fix all these problems. I'll just tell him or her what must be changed, and then we'll be happy. So we come up to our spouse and say, "Dear, I have just a few criticisms, a few little feedback for you about how you could change, and then things will be really great." And you tell them what you'd like them to change, and guess what happens? They don't respond really well. In fact, the natural man or woman will just then tell you all the things that are wrong with you, and all of a sudden there's conflict. No one feels understood. People get discouraged about getting their needs met. All of a sudden the marriage is not in the best state. Now, when there's pornography, of course, the man or a woman, depending on who's the person with the problem, has violated some very cardinal marital principles. Pornography use is committing adultery in the heart. And it's a real threat to the marriage, and so their spouse has all sorts of unpleasant feelings. They feel betrayed, they feel angry, they feel hurt, they want things to be changed, and so sometimes they'll overdo it in their zeal to encourage their spouse to change and use unrighteous dominion themselves by trying to control things, but understandably so. Sometimes people get really depressed because of the spouse's addiction because they feel they'll never have the marriage they want to have, which is true, they won't, because when there's sin in a partner, it tends to influence other people. Addicts often are irritable. They often won't have the Spirit. Sometimes there's real betrayal in terms of lying, or even worse if other partners have been sought out. And so marriages are under tremendous stress. And so it's really important to change that around and start going in a good direction. And as I'm saying this, I realize you can't do justice to describing the amount of hurt that's occurred, but want to move in a positive direction. One principle that I think causes most of the problems in marriage is agency. So as soon as you violate someone else's agency, we're going to get bad results. It never works. Might get away with it for a few years, but eventually that person is either going to leave, get angry back, or stop loving us. And so Doctrine and Covenants 121:41 is pretty explicit on this. No power or influence can or ought to be maintained by virtue of the priesthood, only by persuasion, by long-suffering, by gentleness and meekness, and by love unfeigned. And of course this goes for the sisters as well who share in the priesthood. Now, we want to talk about the great mistake. This is the mistake most couples make, and especially in the first 8 or 10 years of marriage. It causes innumerable problems. Couples begin to debate about who is right. Like one person will bring out a problem and the other person will have a different opinion, and they'll argue often for years about certain subjects. Some of the most popular subjects to argue about are how to discipline the children, or if you should discipline children. People will argue about how much attention they need. People will argue about money. The debating about these subjects and people exchanging their different philosophies and trying to win the other person over can ruin a marriage. People often get very disrespectful because they get upset when they're not getting their needs met or having the other person listen. However, there is a celestial principle that comes into play here. I'd like to read 2 scriptures about contention. 3 Nephi 11:29. For verily, verily, I say unto you, he that has the spirit of contention is not of me, but is of the devil, who is the father of contention. And then Doctrine and Covenants 95:10. Nevertheless, my servant sinned very grievous sin, and contention arose in the school of the prophets. And after the Lord said that, he added, and I sent them forth to be chastened, because he was displeased that his prophets were arguing and having contention, and it's not of the celestial order to do that. This is hard for us human beings because it's quite difficult to imagine not having contention for most people. But there's positive ways to handle conflict, which we're going to talk about. So the celestial way is to have a perfect attitude about changing our own heart and behavior, rather than focusing so much on our spouse. When people are in a marriage and they spend all their energy trying to change their spouse, the spouse naturally gets resentful and is less willing to change. And so when that situation occurs, there's a lot of bad feelings that remain in the marriage. President Benson said, we must follow the Son of God in all that we desire, think, and do. So the best way to have a great marriage is to make sure that we're making great changes. Of course, we need our spouse to do it too, or it doesn't work so well. So the couple as a team needs to agree to follow Christ and to make necessary changes. This is where priesthood leadership comes in. It's kind of interesting talking about priesthood leadership in the home, because women get kind of sensitive about this, and sometimes they have a fear, and they might even say, like, I don't want my husband bossing me around. But real priesthood leadership is not about bossing people around or dominating or really being in charge. It's about the team. So the priesthood holder does have a responsibility to teach true principles in his home, but his wife shares in that responsibility. So together they're to help family members live by every word of God. And the priesthood holder should lead by example. It's not about being a boss, it's about being a good example and inspiring his family. And as if wife's of the same mind and heart, then it's just easier because she's his counselor. And they're supposed to work in unity to find ways to implement celestial principles. The main areas to make changes in to begin to make the marriage better are love, respect, sacrifice, and responsibility. Most problems have their root in one of those 4 areas: love, respect, sacrifice, responsibility. President Marion G. Romney said, a husband and wife should be one in harmony, respect, and mutual consideration. Neither should plan or follow an independent course of action. They should consult, pray, and decide together. Remember that neither the wife nor the husband is the slave of the other. And here's an important sentence for the For the women, husband and wives are equal partners, so there need not be any fear about priesthood leadership when done properly. So the priesthood leader does have some obligation to set forth correct principles and lead by example. The spouse has a responsibility to contribute as well, and both have veto power. So all decisions by couples need to be unanimous. That can require patience sometimes, so if you can't agree, you really can't proceed. But unity is so important, and if you respect the value of that principle, folks can get okay with that. So when there's a conflict, the couple should pray, listen to each other, and work together to study the matter and discover the celestial principles involved. We should be duty-bound to follow those principles once we know what they are. And then led by the Spirit, we can find solutions or agreeable compromises. When our hearts are right, it's not that hard. So resolving conflict is a particularly challenging enterprise, but there's a few things we can do that make it much easier. I want to talk about the emotional equivalent of walking on water, which is to learn how to communicate and using vulnerability and empathy. This gets us on the right track and avoids the usual argument. And so vulnerability is pretty simple. The best way to do vulnerability is just share what would make me happy is, and then you just tell your spouse what you want, and you drop it. And you give them a chance to do the right thing. And it works surprisingly well, but people have a hard time doing that because they don't like that feeling of being vulnerable because the spouse might not do what they want. But nonetheless, it's good to try that. Oftentimes it works. If that doesn't work, which is certainly not going to work 100% of the time, you have to have discussions about these things. I have a listening skills sheet that I have people learn how to use. And the way it works is we want each person to share, but in a way that they feel comfortable. So each person starts by taking 1 to 2 minutes to make their point. The other person just listens, they don't interrupt, but they do follow the time guidelines. So after say 2 minutes, if that's what the couple wants to do, you say, okay, your time's up. Then the person who was listening then uses empathy. They can use reflective listening. What I hear you saying is, and these things are coming from a sheet, and so it's pretty easy to follow. If couples really struggle with communication, I actually have them write out their answers as they're listening, and before they talk to each other. So you can even go in separate rooms and write out your answers to the empathy sheet. So first you say what you heard them saying. What I hear you saying is, then you find some agreement. I agree that, and then use empathy and consider their feelings and say you must feel sad, hurt, frustrated, angry, discouraged, anxious, whatever. And then you can validate and say your points have merit because, and then you add support. I would be willing to. Now, naturally, your spouse is going to really like hearing what you agree on and hearing you in a caring way empathize with their feelings and validating what they want. We're reluctant to do that because we think we're going to lose the argument, but in marriage, it's not about arguing. It's not a debate. Winning the debate doesn't mean your spouse is going to cooperate. So we have to try this different tact of joining them, and you can, at the end, you'll have some time, after you both practice these listening skills, then you have some time to think about what solutions might work. But this is about caring about the other person's point of view and feelings. The next step, after both have you gotten through the feelings thing and both people have participated, that is, each person takes that 2 minutes to share their thoughts and feelings, the other person practices listening. Then you're ready to get to the work phase where you work together to find celestial principles that are related to this concern. And it's good to pray for assistance in this very difficult task. And of course, you want to have a willingness to follow all celestial principles. The Savior presides over our marriages, and He wants us to follow His principles. We can consider what is right and reasonable, how most people handle this type of situation. We can look at the scriptures. We can do some research to find different possible answers to the problems, books, internet, general authorities, support people. And then we can search for solutions, share what we're willing to concede unilaterally, that is, without expecting anything like, yeah, I can wash dishes on Tuesday and Thursday. Or you can make some other kind of offer or find a compromise or agree on what's called a quid pro quo agreement. If you will do this, I will do that. I'll give you an example. Like suppose one of the couple wants to join a yoga class and it's on Thursday night. And the husband might say not like that because he doesn't feel comfortable when his wife's outside the house, or perhaps he doesn't like watching the kids after working all day. But you say, well, what's the celestial principle? And that would be each person needs personal time. That just seemed to be reality, that we should all have time to do things we need to do to fill our buckets. And we shouldn't try to control our mate. And so if the husband was being honest, he would say, yeah, that is a celestial principle. I should support you. But on the other hand, he might have some angle like, how about if you don't go out till 7 o'clock? Because I get home at 6 o'clock. I want to eat before I handle the kids. And so they could work out some sort of agreement. And if each is trying to live in accordance to correct principles, it's not too hard. Wanted to talk also about how to handle the elephant in the room of pornography problem. Wives generally are pretty anxious, especially if they see their husband acting a little differently or feel like he might be acting out. And she'll ask him, sometimes he gets resentful of being checked on. And so it's important that they start communicating in a positive way. So I prescribe what I call a daily check-in. And so in the daily check-in, the husband can share how he's doing with his desires, but also share his emotions and what he's been up to. So to share how you're doing with desires, I like the traffic light approach, which is green, yellow, red. So green, I'm feeling good, my mood's good, haven't had desires, I'm in good shape. So you don't have to have much discussion if he says green. Yellow is moderate temptation or some mood problems, like person's feeling anxious or depressed. And then red is a danger zone, like I've been triggered, I'm really in jeopardy. And then the wife could help him to say and decide, well, maybe I should stay away from media. What can I do to change my mood? You can also check in on how you're doing physically, emotionally. If there's been any slips, they need to be reported. People should be reporting anything important in terms of slips within 24 hours and as soon as possible. You can talk about spiritual experiences, social encounters. Positive living is something we talk about in these videos. Things like staying in the moment, ability to remain peaceful, using tools to manage emotions. You could check in on successes with those things. And then sharing of significant events, happy moments, any frustrations, interesting things, what happened at work. And I think it's really healthy for spouses to share in each other's lives. And generally speaking, wives want a little more information from their husband than, how was work? Fine, dear. It's really important because it helps us feel more connected. Another thing I advise is that the spouse can be a very valuable recovery partner and helper spouse. So if the addicted spouse says he's yellow or red, the partner can go through the self-management formula, which is a formula that kind of tells you the different things you should be doing to deal with temptation. Then she can help him find some tools. Have the coping skills app, which is on my website, which lists all the emotional coping skills. Now she can help him with those, go over some of those tools, but if he doesn't like that, then she can just suggest that he do it. And so he can come back and report to her, yeah, I was feeling kind of depressed, but I worked through it, and this is what I thought, and I'm good now. And so she still knows what he's doing, rather than her worrying about whether he's going to act out, because emotional negative periods are a huge trigger for acting out. In fact, the main reason people act out. And so the wife is let in and he's sharing more of how he's feeling, then the wife sort of understands things and can develop more compassion as she sees that he unfortunately had learned to use acting out to deal with emotions. And then the wife can check in, because husband should know about her life, and if she's having negative emotions, he can give her support and listen. And all these things should be done in a positive, respectful manner. There always has to be balance in a marriage. You can't have one person giving a lot more than the other. But it does take one person to start the positive cycle. And as they do that, they can encourage their mate from a higher position where the mate's really clear that they are trying very hard and being giving. Then each person can give their best effort and they know it'll be rewarded. If one person is giving a lot and the other person's not responding, then they can just have a work slowdown and say, well, I just don't feel like doing those things because you're not working very hard in the marriage. And this can be done in a loving way, but it's necessary because balance is just essential to a good marriage. If you're giving too much, you get resentful. And people often can argue about who's giving more, and it should be a healthy competition to try to always be pleasing your mate. Sometimes to avoid frequent arguments or discussions that are unproductive, you can just have, say, weekly meetings or even every other week where you talk about the marriage. Because sometimes couples are reluctant to communicate because it ends up being an argument about the problems. And so it's important to have fun and not talk about problems all the time. So if that's a concern, you can just set aside a kind of regular time to have productive discussions. If you're using the listening skills and using empathy, there really shouldn't be any contention. So the action plan for this chapter is, if you're married or in a close relationship, practice the communication skills outlined in this chapter, and then consider using a daily check-in regarding addiction and recovery. I wish you well. I know it's difficult to change things in a marriage, but of course very rewarding and of eternal significance to make progress in this. So I wish you the very best in this endeavor. May the Lord be with you. Thank you.